Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and plastered it with bitumen and pitch, and she put the child in it and placed it amongst the reeds on the bank of the river Nile, and his sister Miriam stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river while her attendants walked beside the river, and she saw the basket amongst the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and he was crying, so she took pity on him. "Oh, this must be one of the Hebrew children," she said. Then his sister said to the Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it, and I will give you wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it, and when the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and Pharaoh's daughter took him as a son. And she named him Moses, because, she said, "I drew him out of the water." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. World War II prompted the largest displacement of human beings the world has ever seen. Many of those displaced people were Jews, fleeing from the deadly bigotry of the Nazi regime in Germany and as it ramped up in Western and Eastern Europe. And in June of 1939, the German ocean liner the St. Louis and its 937 passengers, who were almost all Jewish, were turned away from the port of Miami. They were forced to return to Europe. More than a quarter of those passengers would die in concentration camps during the Holocaust. And why? Because President Roosevelt and his cabinet had bought an unfounded lie that Jewish refugees were actually spies for the Nazis. By the time Roosevelt could be convinced that he had propagated a lie, years had passed and millions of Jews had died. Infants, children, adults, whole families, entire villages wiped out, including Anne Frank, who was a passenger on the St. Louis. In my last call, a woman came irregularly, but whenever she was there, she was greeted warmly, and whenever we had a community meal, she would help out. We helped her out with groceries and bills from time to time. Life was hard for her, but she was a good woman, and she was good to her family. Eventually, she started bringing her newest grandbaby to church, and he was a very handsome baby. Very tightly curled curls on his cap, the chubby baby thighs that are only good when you're actually a baby. And soon she pulled me aside and said, "My baby's sick, you know. He's got AIDS." Sometimes she came to church alone because the baby was in the hospital. But that Advent, he was feeling better. And so he was with her, and he was wiggling in the pews, and like you do when you have a wiggly baby, she was sitting on the very edge, so if she needed to get out quickly, she wouldn't have to get out over a bunch of people. So I was preaching there about the baby to be born, preaching down on the floor, and quite unexpectedly, the baby in the pews started crawling very quickly away from her towards me. She was embarrassed and tried to get up to get him, but I got him first. And so that Sunday, for a while, I preached, holding onto a baby who held on to my stole. After church, a member said, "You know that baby has AIDS, right?" Last week, 96 children died in Aleppo, Syria. On Friday, one of my friends posted a CNN video on Facebook, which had been filmed in the ruins of a bombed-out section of Idlib, which is 50 minutes south, but also under fire. A man in a white hat was racing towards an ambulance, and in his arms he held a baby. The infant was covered in dust, and you could not tell whether that baby was dead or alive. It had been under the ruins of a building for 2 hours. The rescuer's face was grimy and despairing as he held onto the baby, held onto it while emergency responders tried to revive it, and suddenly and softly, the baby cried. And then that grown man, covered in dust, who had already seen too much death, began to sob. Long, plaintive cries intermingled with prayers, repeated over and over, "Thank God, she doesn't have any wounds at all, thank God." Friday afternoon, it was announced that Governor Greg Abbott has pulled Texas out of the federal refugee resettlement program. As governor, he said, "I will continue to prioritize the safety of Texans." You couldn't have told me when I was a child that I would grow up and learn that there's such thing as the wrong kind of baby. In our scriptures this morning, the good fortune of the tribes of Jacob have turned very bad. Now remember, the tribes of the Hebrew people were in Goshen and Egypt, refugees because of famine that had driven them out of their land. Joseph had been the youngest of the tribes of Jacob and had become the second in command of all of Egypt, and because he had heeded God's warnings, plenty of food had been stored up to feed Egypt and to feed all of the refugees, including the Hebrew tribes. But the pharaohs who knew Joseph died, and a new pharaoh took power, and that Pharaoh was afraid of all the refugees in his midst. He was sure that they would rise up and threaten his power, so he began to propagate lies amongst the Egyptian people that the Hebrews were actually going to conspire against them with their enemies to kill them all. So the Pharaoh enslaved those people, and he tried to have them work such long hours that they would not be unwilling or unable to procreate. Unsurprisingly, that failed. Humans will find a way. And so he employed midwives to murder infant baby Hebrew boys the moment they were born. Those midwives disobeyed. And so the Pharaoh ordered his soldiers to murder any Hebrew baby boy under the age of 3. And then, you know this story, a baby is born, not just any baby, an unallowed baby boy, and his mother places him in a basket and puts him in the Nile because the Nile was safer than her home. And the Nile transported that infant into the presence of the Pharaoh's daughter, who immediately knew what he was. In the Hebrew, it is, a Hebrew child. And that should have been the end of that story. He was the wrong kind of baby. He was a Hebrew boy, and under an execution order given by none other than her own father. But here is where the story turns on its head. He was the wrong kind of baby, and she saved him. Saved him and named him Moses, which in Hebrew means drawn out of the water, but in Egyptian, well, that's the name you give to the sons of kings. Part of the problem with familiarity with Scripture is that stories we read and what happens in them feel like foregone conclusions. They feel like morals or fables that we recite to children, and less like the pointed invitations to reflect on our own failures that they actually are. We read the story of Pharaoh's daughter saving Moses, and we think, of course, but that's the last thing we should think when we read this story. Pharaoh's daughter is purposefully defying the command of her father, and if word gets out what she has done, she will be executed. What she did was stupid. It was stupid and it was risky with no possible foreseeable reward. She risked everything by being compassionate to the wrong baby. And the scandal of Scripture is that this stupid, risky, foreign, non-Jew woman is the hero. And like Jesus says when he tells parables, the implicit purpose is, now you go and do that. We're not supposed to read Scripture to be entertained. We read Scripture to be changed, to be confronted by our broken places, to our blindness, and to live differently. And the inescapable lesson of a story like this cannot be anything other than go and show compassion to the wrong babies, to the wrong children, to the wrong people, to the ones who can harm you. And doing that is the will of God. But we are not Egyptians, and we do not have Hebrew slaves in our midst, so we must look around in the world and wonder together, who are the wrong babies here? Whose lives are we told, either implicitly or explicitly, don't matter as much or at all? From what I can tell, transgender elementary school kids are definitely the wrong kind of baby, because this could all just be a ruse to assault people in bathrooms. Also, maybe all poor white kids in America are the wrong kind of baby, because it's really hard to escape cycles of poverty, and lots of their families are drug addicted, so they're most likely going to be a drain on our social services. Maybe African American children in Flint, Michigan, who have been poisoned by lead for the last year, maybe those are the wrong kind of babies too. Because it's far away from us and it's the government's fault, it's not our business. Probably Central American children who flood across our borders are the wrong kind of babies. Because they're draining our infrastructure and they're probably going to try to steal our jobs. And definitely Syrian refugee children. Those are the wrong kind of babies, because they could just be hiding radicalized members of ISIS who will kill us once they get across our borders. Right? Did I get all the wrong babies? We got plenty of reasons. I got all the reasons why any number of kids, children, people are the wrong kind of people, and that we can wash our hands of them and not be concerned about it. And by we, I don't just mean Americans, I mean all people, have an incredible ability to justify why we don't actually have to be compassionate. Weirdly enough, a lot of our justifications for foregoing compassion either have to do with saving money or being safe. Don't we want to do the fiscally responsible thing? Don't we want to keep the people we love safe? Who lied? Who lied to you and who lied to me that doing the right thing would ever make us safe? Showing compassion to the wrong people, to the wrong babies, is absolutely dangerous and is absolutely a requirement of Christian life. We follow a man who, if you remember, told us to love our enemies and then was killed by his enemies. We follow a man who told us to pray for those who persecute us and to turn the other cheek when we are attacked. We follow a man who told us that the world will hate us We follow a man who told us that we need to feed the hungry and we need to visit the people in prison and that we need to give to whoever begs from us, and that none of that is conditional upon the character of the person who fits those descriptions. We follow Jesus, who told his disciples explicitly that following him was a guaranteed chance of bearing their own crosses of suffering, and they all died suffering. Jesus' vulnerability towards his love, his compassion for the wrong people absolutely got him killed, and that is what we are called to. Compassion is not the same thing as sympathy. Compassion is love married to grief that chooses to act. And it has always been our dangerous responsibility. I'll prove it to you in this story. I'll spoil the end of it for you. Moses grows up and murders an Egyptian overseer and then runs away. He's a criminal immigrant. He eventually comes back into town and foments revolution and insurrection, leading his people out of slavery, and in the process, the livestock of Egypt are decimated by boils and fleas. The firstborn children of all of Egypt die mysteriously overnight, and the fighting men of Pharaoh's army all drown in the Red Sea. If you're a part of the Hebrew people, all of those are really great things. But if you're an Egyptian, you're pretty angry at Pharaoh's daughter, because it turns out that there are consequences when you save the wrong baby. But here's the thing. God has, and God always will be, on the side of the wrong kinds of babies. God has been and always will be on the side of the weak and the powerless and the hurting and the oppressed and the suffering and the forgotten. Always. God is not for emperors. God is not for empires. God is not for seats of power or accumulating riches for influence and authority over others. Jesus preached that when he was coming, the good news he was bringing was for poor people, for blind people, for powerless people. Jesus preached that God would actually bring down the powerful. Mary promised it in her song about Jesus' birth. He will bring the powerful off of their thrones. And that sure did turn out to be the story in Moses, didn't it? We can trust that God will bring down the powerful because God has already done that before. So what? There's a painful question lurking in the text that maybe we read this story quickly to get around it so we don't have to answer it, but the question is, whose side are we on? There is a side that is concerned with power. There is a side that is concerned with protecting itself, with seeing suffering and shaking your head and making a political slogan out of, that's not my problem. That's Pharaoh's side. And then there's a side which makes no distinction between us and them, that forgives everything, that acts sacrificially, that loves beyond reason, that risks everything for strangers, that sells all of its possessions to give to the poor, the side that chooses death if it will save just one little lost lamb in the ruins of Aleppo. That's the side of Pharaoh's daughter. That's the side of the midwives who refused Pharaoh. That's the side of Jesus. And the way I see it, if we're Christians before anything else, we have to choose. We can chase safety. We can put ourselves first. We can be Pharaoh in this land again. Or we can chase compassion, and we can risk everything for the wrong babies of the world, no matter how much danger it puts us in. We can be like the Pharaoh's daughter. But we have to choose. And we have to choose wisely. Because only one of those sides is God on.